I'm Lucas Bennett, 43, and I just walked out of prison after 20 years for a crime I didn't commit. 20 years of my life stolen, my 20s, my 30s, gone. I miss my daughter's childhood, my mother's funeral, and countless moments I'll never get back. The real killer? My supposed accomplice who let me rot while he lived free. But 3 weeks ago, something broke inside him, and the confession he made didn't just set me free. It revealed a truth that will shake you to your core. If you've ever wondered how our justice system can fail so completely, and what happens when the truth finally surfaces after 2 decades of lies, like and subscribe. This story isn't just about my innocence, it's about the price of silence and the power of a guilty conscience that couldn't stay buried forever. March 16th, 1999. I was 23 years old, working construction and living in a small apartment on the east side of town. My daughter Sophie had just turned 3, and I was finally getting my life together after a rocky few years. The morning started like any other coffee, toast, and the newspaper while Sophie played with her blocks on the living room floor. The arrest warrant that would destroy my life was already signed and sealed, sitting on Detective Morrison's desk downtown. But I didn't know that. I was just Lucas Bennett, a young father trying to make ends meet, planning to take Sophie to the park after my shift ended. The pounding on my door came at 6:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was watching the morning news, and they just announced the traffic report. Sophie looked up from her toys, confused by the urgent knocking. "Police! Open up!" My heart hammered against my ribs. I'd never been in serious trouble before, a few speeding tickets, nothing more. I opened the door to find 4 officers, their faces grim and determined. "Lucas Bennett? Yes, that's me. You're under arrest for the murder of Harold Winters." The world tilted. Harold Winters, I knew that name from the news. The convenience store owner who'd been shot and killed 2 nights ago. But what did that have to do with me? "There's been a mistake," I said, even as they pushed me against the wall, cold handcuffs clicking around my wrists. "I don't know what you're talking about." Sophie started crying. The sound of her tears still haunts me 20 years later. "Daddy?" "It's okay, baby," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady as they read me my rights. "Call Grandma," I told my neighbor, Mrs. Chun, who'd appeared in her doorway. "Please take care of Sophie." As they led me away, I caught sight of the arrest warrant in Detective Morrison's hand. My name was typed clearly at the top, along with charges that made my blood run cold. 1st degree, murder, armed robbery, conspiracy to commit murder. In the back of the police car, I kept thinking this had to be a mistake. Someone with my name, maybe. A case of mistaken identity? Things like this happen in movies, not to regular people like me. But as we drove to the station, Detective Morrison turned around and said something that made my stomach drop. "Your buddy Tyler Blackwood already told us everything." Tyler Blackwood. I hadn't spoken to Tyler in over a year. We'd been friends in high school, but he'd gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd after graduation. The last time I'd seen him, he'd asked to borrow money for what he claimed was a job interview suit. I'd given him $50 and never heard from him again. Now, apparently he was saying I was his accomplice in murder. The crime scene photos would become burned into my memory not because I was there, but because I stared at them for hours during my trial, desperately trying to find some clue that would prove my innocence. Harold Winters had been a fixture in our neighborhood for 15 years. His convenience store, Hal's Quick Stop, sat on the corner of Pine and 4th Street, a place where everyone knew your name and your usual order. Harold was 58, a widower who treated his customers like family. He had 3 daughters, all grown, and 5 grandchildren who visited him at the store after school. March 14th, 1999, 11:43 p.m., according to the police report. 2 masked figures entered Hal's Quick Stop. The security camera, mounted high in the corner, captured everything in grainy black and white. The timestamp glowed in the bottom right corner like an electronic witness. Figure 1, tall and lanky, went straight to the counter. Figure 2, shorter and stockier, remained by the door as a lookout. Both wore dark hoodies and baseball caps, pulled low over their faces. Harold had been alone, counting the day's receipts. The cash register held $340. Not much for a life, but apparently enough for someone desperate. The investigation showed Harold had cooperated fully. He'd opened the register without resistance, even helped bag the small bills, but it wasn't enough for the tall figure. According to the forensics team, Harold was shot twice in the chest at close range with a .38 caliber revolver. The first shot killed him instantly. The second seemed almost spiteful, unnecessary. The entire robbery lasted 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Along with the cash, they took a single pack of Marlboro cigarettes from behind the counter. The cigarettes would later become a crucial piece of evidence, not because they led to the killers, but because Tyler claimed I'd specifically asked him to grab them for me. The community was devastated. Harold's funeral drew over 200 people. His daughter spoke about a man who'd given free candy to children, who'd let struggling families buy groceries on credit during hard times, who'd stayed open late on holidays so people could get milk or bread for their families. The police department felt enormous pressure to solve the case quickly. Harold was beloved, and his murder felt like an attack on the entire neighborhood. Within 48 hours, they had Tyler Blackwood in custody on an unrelated drug charge. Within 72 hours, Tyler was telling them all about his accomplice. Me, according to Tyler's version of events, I was the mastermind. I'd supposedly planned the whole thing, chosen the target, and insisted on the late-night timing. He painted me as someone who'd grown frustrated with my construction job, who wanted easy money to support my daughter. The prosecution's timeline went like this. Tyler and I had met at Murphy's Bar on March 12th to plan the robbery. I'd driven U.S. to the store on March 14th, but stayed in the car while Tyler went inside. When Tyler came back out, I was angry that he'd killed Harold. The plan had supposedly been just to rob him, not to commit murder. Cell phone records showed Tyler had called me 3 times that week. The calls were brief, less than 2 minutes each, but the prosecution claimed they were evidence of our conspiracy. My phone had also pinged cell towers in the area of the store, though those same towers covered about a quarter of the city, including the construction site where I'd been working. The physical evidence was thin. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses who could identify either figure in the security footage. The murder weapon was never found. But Tyler's testimony would prove to be more powerful than any physical evidence. He knew details about my life. That made his story credible. He knew about Sophie, about my struggles with child support, about my frustration with my job. He knew I'd been trying to save money for a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. What he didn't know, what I couldn't prove, was that I'd been home that night, putting Sophie to bed and watching television. I was alone, so I had no alibi. In the eyes of the law, that made me the perfect accomplice. I first met Tyler Blackwood in 9th grade English class. He was the new kid, having moved to our small town after his parents' messy divorce. While I was focused on passing my classes and playing JV basketball, Tyler was already running small. Scam selling fake hall passes, organizing poker games in the school parking lot, always looking for an angle. Our high school yearbook shows us together at the junior prom, both wearing rented tuxedos and awkward grins. Tyler had convinced me to double date with him and 2 sisters from the next town over. I was shy around girls, but Tyler had enough confidence for both of us. He could talk his way into or out of anything. Tyler's father had abandoned the family when Tyler was 12, leaving his mother to raise 3 kids on a waitress's salary. His older brother was already in and out of juvenile detention. His younger sister struggled with an eating disorder that the family couldn't afford to treat properly. Tyler learned early that the world didn't give you anything you had to take. By senior year, our friendship was strained. I was working part-time at a grocery store, saving money for a community college. Tyler was dealing marijuana and bragging about the easy money. When I got my girlfriend pregnant senior year, Tyler offered to help me out by getting me involved in his business. I refused, and that created a rift between us. After graduation, I focused on becoming a father and learning a trade. Tyler drifted deeper into petty crime. He'd call me occasionally, usually when he needed money or a place to crash. I'd help when I could. But Sophie was my priority. The last time I saw Tyler before my arrest was in February 1999. He'd shown up at my apartment, disheveled and nervous, claiming he had a job interview the next day but needed money for interview clothes. He looked terrible thin, jittery, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he was using harder drugs than marijuana. "Just $50, Lucas," he'd said, standing in my doorway. "I'll pay you back as soon as I get the job." I knew he was lying about the job interview, but I also knew he was desperate. I gave him the money, more out of pity than friendship. He promised to stay in touch, to let me know how things worked out. "You're a good friend," he'd said, and for a moment, I saw the scared kid from high school, who'd never had anyone he could count on. That was the last conversation we had as free men, when the police told me. Tyler had implicated me in Harold's murder. I couldn't believe it. Tyler was capable of theft, of selling drugs, of small-time fraud, but murder? And to drag me into it? Later, I learned that Tyler had been arrested on March 15th, the day after Harold's murder, for possession of methamphetamine. He was looking at his third strike, which meant a mandatory life sentence under the state's habitual offender law. Suddenly, he had information about a murder that could save his life. The police didn't have to pressure him. Tyler volunteered the information, calling Detective Morrison from his jail cell and saying he had details about the convenience store killing. He spun a story that painted me as the mastermind and himself as the reluctant accomplice who'd been coerced into participation. Tyler claimed I'd been planning the robbery for weeks, that I'd chosen Harold's store because I knew the old man wouldn't fight back. He said I'd driven the getaway car and had grown angry when he'd killed Harold, insisting that murder hadn't been part of the plan. The most damaging part of Tyler's story was how well he knew me. He could describe the inside of my apartment, knew about my financial struggles, could recite conversations we'd had years earlier. To investigators, this level of detail made his testimony credible. What they didn't know was that Tyler had always been a gifted liar. In high school, he'd convinced teachers that his homework was stolen, that he'd been sick during tests, that other students had cheated off his papers. He had a talent for weaving truth with fiction in ways that made his lies almost impossible to detect. Tyler painted me as someone who'd grown bitter about my circumstances, who resented having to work construction while watching other people get ahead. He claimed I'd talked about wanting to score big so I could give Sophie the life she deserved. The cruelest part was how he used my love for my daughter against me. He told police that I'd said I was tired of being a nobody and wanted to be the kind of father who could buy his daughter anything she wanted. Those words stung because they contained a grain of truth. I did want to provide better for Sophie, but I would never have chosen crime as the path to that goal. The first day of my trial arrived like a storm I'd been watching approach for months. I sat in the defendant's chair wearing a borrowed suit that didn't fit properly, my hands shaking as I tried to project innocence to a jury of 12 strangers. Who would decide my fate? My court-appointed attorney, James Fletcher, was a young man barely out of law school who'd been assigned to my case because the state had to provide representation. He was overwhelmed, handling 17 other cases simultaneously, and had maybe 3 hours to prepare for what would become the most important week of my life. Fletcher was a good man with good intentions, but he was drowning. During our brief meetings, he'd shuffle through files while talking to me, sometimes mixing up details from other cases. He'd never handled a murder trial before, and his inexperience showed in everything from his opening statement to his failure to object to clearly prejudicial testimony. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Catherine Ross, painted me as a cold-blooded killer who'd manipulated my childhood friend into helping me commit murder. In her opening statement, she told the jury that I was the mastermind behind Harold's death, a man who'd grown frustrated with honest work and decided to take what I wanted through violence. "Lucas Bennett may look like an ordinary young father," she said, pointing directly at me, "but the evidence will show that he planned and executed a robbery that resulted in the senseless murder of Harold Winters, a beloved member of our community." The prosecution's narrative was simple and compelling. I was the brains, Tyler was the muscle, and together we killed an innocent man for $340 and a pack of cigarettes. They presented the cell phone records showing Tyler had called me 3 times that week, the cell tower data placing my phone in the general area of the store, and most damaging of all, they had Tyler's detailed testimony about our supposed conspiracy. Fletcher's opening statement was nervous and disjointed. He promised to prove my innocence but seemed uncertain about how he'd accomplish that goal. He mentioned the lack of physical evidence, the unreliability of Tyler's testimony, and my lack of any criminal history, but he couldn't weave these elements into a coherent defense strategy. The first witnesses were Harold's daughters, who testified about their father's character and the impact of his death on their family. Their pain was genuine and heartbreaking, and I found myself crying along with them. I wanted to stand up and tell them that I wasn't the one who'd taken their father from them, but I could only sit silently as they described how his murder had shattered their lives. The security footage was played dozens of times during the trial. Each viewing felt like torture as I watched two masked figures, one of whom was supposedly me, enter Harold's store and commit murder. The video was grainy and dark, making identification impossible, but the prosecution didn't need clear images. They had Tyler's testimony to fill in the details. Detective Morrison took the stand on the second day, walking the jury through the investigation. He explained how Tyler had voluntarily provided information about the crime, how the cell phone records corroborated Tyler's story, and how I'd been unable to provide an alibi for the time of the murder. Fletcher's cross-examination was ineffective. He failed to challenge Morrison's assumptions, didn't press him on the lack of physical evidence, and missed opportunities to highlight inconsistencies in the investigation. When Fletcher asked Morrison why no fingerprints or DNA evidence connected me to the crime, Morrison simply replied that the perpetrators had been careful to avoid leaving evidence. The cell phone records were particularly damaging. Tyler had called me 3 times between March 12th and March 14th, including a call on the afternoon of the murder. The prosecution claimed these calls were evidence of our conspiracy, planning sessions where we'd coordinated the robbery. In reality, Tyler had been calling to ask for more money. He'd spent the $50 I'd given him on drugs and was desperate for another loan. I'd refused, telling him I couldn't keep supporting his habit. The call on March 14th had lasted less than 30 seconds, just long enough for me to tell him I couldn't help him, but Fletcher didn't present this interpretation convincingly. He didn't subpoena my phone records to show the content of other calls, didn't demonstrate Tyler's pattern of calling me for money, and didn't establish a timeline that would have made conspiracy impossible. My family sat in the gallery every day, their faces a mixture of determination and despair. My mother held Sophie on her lap, whispering explanations about why Daddy couldn't come home. My father's jaw was clenched in permanent anger, furious at a system that could accuse his son of murder based on such thin evidence. Sophie was too young to understand what was happening, but she sensed the tension. She'd wave at me from the gallery, calling out, "Hi, Daddy," in her innocent 3-year-old voice. Those moments were simultaneously the best and worst parts of each day. Best because I could see my daughter. Worse because I might be seeing her for the last time as a free man. Tyler's sworn statement was the prosecution's star witness, and when he took the stand on the third day of trial, I felt like I was watching my own execution. The man who had once been my friend was about to destroy my life with a web of lies, so detailed and convincing that even I sometimes wondered if I was misremembering my own innocence. Tyler had cleaned up for his court appearance. Gone were the bloodshot eyes and hollow cheeks I'd seen in February. He wore a simple gray suit and spoke in a soft, remorseful voice that made him seem like a reluctant witness rather than a calculating liar saving his own life. District Attorney Ross led him through his testimony with practiced precision. Tyler claimed that I had approached him in early March, frustrated with my financial situation and desperate to provide better for Sophie. According to his story, I had suggested robbing Harold's store because I knew the old man wouldn't resist. Lucas said Harold was an easy target, Tyler testified, his voice barely above a whisper. He said old Harold wouldn't fight back, that we could be in and out in 5 minutes with enough money to solve both our problems. The lies came so easily that I wondered if Tyler had actually convinced himself they were true. He described fictional planning sessions where we'd supposedly scouted the store, discussed the timing, and decided on our approach. He claimed I'd insisted on using his gun, a .38 revolver that he'd never shown me because I'd never seen it. I didn't want to hurt anyone, Tyler continued, tears forming in his eyes. I told Lucas we should just take the money and leave. But he said Harold might call the police too quickly, that we needed to make sure he couldn't identify us. The most damaging part of Tyler's testimony was his account of the murder itself. He claimed that I'd been the one who'd shot Harold, that I'd fired twice in what Tyler described as cold blood. According to Tyler, he'd been horrified by my actions and had begged me to stop. I never thought Lucas would actually kill him, Tyler said, breaking down in apparent anguish. I knew Lucas was desperate, but I never thought he was capable of murder. Tyler's performance was masterful. He portrayed himself as a reluctant accomplice who'd been manipulated by his more desperate friend. He admitted to being at the scene, but claimed he'd never touched the gun, never threatened Harold, and had only served as a lookout while I committed the actual robbery and murder the prosecution then led. Tyler threw details that only someone who knew me well could provide. He described my apartment, my relationship with Sophie, my struggles with child support payments. He knew about my construction job, my schedule, even my favorite television shows. Lucas was always talking about wanting to be a better father, Tyler testified. He said he was tired of being broke, tired of not being able to buy Sophie the things she wanted. He said he deserved better, that life owed him more than what he was getting. These words were particularly devastating because they contained kernels of truth. I had talked about wanting to provide better for Sophie, about feeling frustrated with my financial situation. But Tyler had twisted these normal parental concerns into evidence of criminal intent. Fletcher's cross-examination was the most important moment of the trial, and he completely failed to rise to the occasion. Instead of attacking Tyler's credibility, instead of highlighting the deal Tyler had made with prosecutors, instead of exposing the inconsistencies in his story, Fletcher asked gentle questions that allowed Tyler to reinforce his narrative. "Mr. Blackwood," Fletcher began nervously, "you've admitted to being present during this robbery, is that correct?" "Yes, sir. I was there, and I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life." Fletcher should have pressed Tyler on the specifics of his story, should have demanded explanations for the lack of physical evidence, should have highlighted Tyler's history of drug use and legal troubles. Instead, he asked softball questions that made Tyler appear more sympathetic. "Why didn't you try to stop Mr. Bennett from shooting Mr. Winters?" "I was scared," Tyler replied. "Lucas had the gun, and I didn't know what he might do to me if I tried to interfere. I should have been braver, should have tried to save Harold, but I was a coward." The jury was eating it up. Tyler's remorse seemed genuine, his reluctance to testify convincing. Several jurors were visibly moved by his apparent anguish over Harold's death. When Fletcher finished his cross-examination, I wanted to scream. He had missed every opportunity to discredit Tyler's testimony, had failed to challenge the prosecution's timeline, and had actually made Tyler appear more credible through his questioning during redirect examination. The prosecution reinforced Tyler's key points. They established that Tyler had received a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony, 15 years instead of life without parole, but they framed this as appropriate consideration for his cooperation and remorse. As Tyler stepped down from the witness stand, he glanced at me with what looked like genuine regret. For a moment, I wondered if he felt any guilt about what he was doing to me. But then I reminded myself that Tyler had always been an excellent actor, capable of projecting whatever emotion served his purposes. The damage was done. Tyler had painted me as a cold-blooded killer who'd manipulated him into participating in murder. His testimony was detailed, consistent, and delivered with apparent sincerity. Most importantly, it gave the jury a clear narrative that explained how and why Harold Winters had died, without any physical evidence connecting me to the crime. Without any witnesses placing me at the scene, Tyler's testimony was the foundation of the prosecution's case. And thanks to Fletcher's incompetent cross-examination, that foundation appeared unshakable. The jury deliberated for 3 days, and each hour felt like an eternity. I spent those 72 hours in a holding cell, alternating between desperate hope and crushing despair. Fletcher tried to reassure me that the length of deliberation was a good sign, that it meant the jury was carefully considering the evidence rather than rushing to judgment. But I could see the doubt in his eyes. He knew his defense had been inadequate, knew that Tyler's testimony had been devastating, knew that we'd failed to present a compelling alternative theory of the crime. My family maintained a vigil outside the courthouse. My mother organized a prayer circle with members of our church, holding hands in the parking lot and asking God to reveal the truth. My father paced the hallways, his face growing more haggard with each passing hour. Sophie stayed with my aunt. Too young to understand why everyone was so upset, but sensing that something terrible was happening. On the morning of the third day, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. I was escorted from the holding cell to the courtroom, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely sign the papers Fletcher placed in front of me. The courtroom was packed. Harold's family sat in the front row, their faces a mixture of anticipation and grief. My family occupied the opposite side, my mother clutching a tissue and my father's arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. Judge Harrison called the court to order, and the jury filed in. I searched their faces desperately for any sign of how they'd voted, but their expressions were carefully neutral. The foreman, a middle-aged man who worked as an accountant, held the verdict form with steady hands. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Harrison asked. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of murder in the first degree, how do you find?" The seconds stretched like hours. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, could feel my mother's eyes on me from the gallery, could sense the weight of 23 years of life hanging in the balance. "We find the defendant, Lucas Bennett, guilty." The word guilty hit me like a physical blow. The courtroom erupted in noise. Harold's family crying with relief, my family crying with despair, reporters scribbling notes, and the judge calling for order. But I couldn't hear any of it. I was trapped in a bubble of disbelief, staring at the guilty verdict form as if it might change if I looked at it hard enough. "On the charge of armed robbery, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, how do you find?" "Guilty." Each guilty was another nail in the coffin of my future. I turned to look at my family, and the sight of their faces nearly broke me. My mother had collapsed against my father, sobbing uncontrollably. My father's face was a mask of rage and helplessness, his hands clenched into fists as if he wanted to fight the entire system that had failed his son. But it was Sophie who destroyed me. She was standing on the bench, reaching her small arms toward me over the gallery railing, crying, "Daddy! Daddy!" In a voice that would haunt my dreams for the next 20 years. Fletcher put his hand on my shoulder, but I barely felt it. I was watching my 3-year-old daughter cry for her father, knowing that I wouldn't be there to comfort her, wouldn't be there to read her bedtime stories, or help her with homework or walk her down the aisle at her wedding, Judge Harrison scheduled. Sentencing for the following week, but we all knew what the outcome would be. First-degree murder carried a life sentence, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. At 23, I was looking at spending the rest of my youth behind bars. As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, I turned one last time to look at my family. My mother was being supported by my aunt, her face streaked with tears. My father was trying to remain strong, but I could see the devastation in his eyes. And Sophie was still reaching for me, still calling my name, still believing that her daddy would somehow come home. "I love you," I mouthed to them, not trusting my voice to carry the words. "We love you too," my mother managed to say before the bailiff led me away. The walk from the courtroom to the holding cell felt like a funeral march. I had been found guilty of a crime I didn't commit, condemned by the testimony of a man who had betrayed our friendship to save his own life. The jury had believed Tyler's lies over my truth, had accepted his version of events despite the lack of physical evidence. As I sat in the holding cell, waiting to be transported back to jail, I tried to process what had just happened. I was no longer Lucas Bennett, construction worker and father. I was Lucas Bennett, convicted murderer, sentenced to spend the best years of my life in prison for a crime I didn't commit. The guilty verdict form sat on the table in front of me. Official and final. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, the foreman had signed his name, certifying that 12 citizens had found me guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But I knew the truth. I knew that I had never entered Harold's store, had never held a gun, had never taken a life. I knew that Tyler had lied to save himself, that the system had failed, that an innocent man was about to disappear into the prison system. The question that would consume me for the next 20 years was simple. How do you prove your innocence when the world has already decided you're guilty? The intake photo they took on my first day at Millbrook Correctional Facility shows a broken man. My eyes are hollow, my face gaunt from months of stress and poor jail food. The number placard I'm holding, 47,291, would become my identity for the next 20 years. Prison is a world unto itself, with its own rules, its own hierarchy, its own brutal logic. I learned quickly that survival meant understanding the unwritten code that governed every interaction. Keep your head down, mind your own business, and never show weakness. The moment other inmates sense fear or vulnerability, you become a target. My cellmate for the first 6 months was a lifer named Raymond Washington who'd been inside for 15 years. Raymond was in his 50s, a former gang member who'd found religion and spent his days reading the Bible and writing letters to his grandchildren. He took it upon himself to educate me about prison survival. "You got two choices in here," Raymond told me on my first night. "You can let this place break you, or you can use the time to become someone better. Most men choose to break. Don't be most men." The hardest part wasn't the violence or the terrible food or the constant noise. It was the crushing realization that I was invisible to the outside world. I was no longer Lucas Bennett, the young father trying to build a better life. I was just another convicted murderer, another case file in an overwhelmed system. The appeals process became my obsession. Fletcher had filed the mandatory appeal, but his heart wasn't in it. He was already moving on to other cases, other clients, other problems. The appellate brief he filed was perfunctory, raising technical issues about jury selection and evidence admission, without addressing the fundamental problem. Tyler's testimony had been lies. I spent hours in the law library, teaching myself legal research and procedure. I read case law about false testimony, about ineffective assistance of counsel, about newly discovered evidence. I wrote letters to innocence organizations, to journalists, to anyone who might listen to my story. The responses were always the same. "We received many claims of innocence. Unfortunately, we cannot investigate every case. We wish you the best of luck." My mother visited every week, driving 3 hours each way to sit across from me in the visiting room for 30 minutes. She brought photos of Sophie, updates about her progress in preschool, stories about a life that was moving forward without me. "She asks about you every day," my mother would say, her voice breaking. "She wants to know when you're coming home." How do you explain to a 4-year-old that her father might never come home? How do you tell a child that sometimes the system makes mistakes, that sometimes innocent people get punished for crimes they didn't commit? The letters from Sophie were my lifeline. At first they were just crayon drawings, stick figures of her and me holding hands, hearts and flowers and rainbows. As she got older and learned to write, the letters became more complex, filled with misspelled words and innocent observations about her world. "Dear Daddy," one letter read, "I lost my first tooth today. Mommy says you would be proud." I'd put it under my pillow and the tooth fairy gave me $1. "I'm saving it to buy you a present when you come home. Love, Sophie." I must have read that letter 100 times, crying each time I reached the part about her saving money for me. She was 5 years old and already making sacrifices for her. I'm PR, I saw a needy father. The other inmates gradually accepted me, partly because I kept to myself and partly because Raymond vouched for me. In prison, respect is earned through consistent behavior and careful alliances. I wasn't tough or intimidating, but I was reliable and honest. Qualities that carried weight in a place where most people were neither. I started teaching GED classes to younger inmates, helping them complete their high school educations. Many of them had grown up in poverty, had never learned to read properly, had been failed by the same system that had failed me. Working with them gave me purpose and helped me feel human again. The first Christmas in prison nearly broke me. I sat in my cell, listening to other inmates talk to their families on the phone, imagining Sophie opening presents that I hadn't been able to buy. My mother had sent me a card with a photo of Sophie by the Christmas tree, wearing a red dress and holding a doll on the back. In Sophie's careful handwriting was a message. "Santa brought me a doll, but I asked him to bring you home. He said he's still working on it. I love you, Daddy. I cried until my chest hurt. Mourning not just for my own lost freedom, but for the childhood Sophie was experiencing without her father. Every milestone I missed, her first day of school, her first loose tooth, her first bicycle, felt like another piece of my heart being torn away. The appeals court upheld my conviction, finding no reversible error in the trial proceedings. Fletcher's brief had been inadequate, failing to raise the most compelling issues about Tyler's credibility and the lack of physical evidence. The three-judge panel spent maybe 10 minutes reviewing my case before rubber-stamping the trial courts. Decision. By my second year inside, I had developed a routine that kept me sane. Up at 5 a.m. for count, breakfast in the mess hall, work detail in the prison laundry, lunch, law library research, dinner, and evening lockdown. The routine was numbing but necessary. Without structure, prison time becomes an endless, meaningless void. I maintained my innocence to anyone who would listen, but I learned quickly that most people didn't want to hear it. Guards, counselors, other inmates, they'd all heard claims of innocence before. In prison, everyone is innocent, at least according to their own stories. You gotta let that go, Bennett, Raymond told me one evening as I read legal briefs by the light of my reading lamp. Fighting the past won't change it. Focus on who you want to be when you get out, but I couldn't let it go. Somewhere out there, Tyler Blackwood was living free while I rotted in a cell for his crime. Somewhere out there, Harold's real killer was walking around, probably laughing about how perfectly his plan had worked. The hardest moments came during the quiet times, late at night when the prison finally settled into relative silence. That's when the weight of injustice would hit me like a physical force, making it hard to breathe, hard to think about anything except the 23 years of my life that had been stolen. I would lie on my narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling, and wonder if Sophie would even remember me by the time I got out. Would she understand why I'd been gone? Would she believe in my innocence, or would she assume, like everyone else, that her father was a killer? The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in my 4th year of imprisonment. I was in the laundry room, sorting through piles of prison uniforms, when Guard Martinez approached with an expression I'd never seen before, pity mixed with reluctance. Bennett, you need to call home. Family emergency? My mother's death certificate would later show that she'd been battling pancreatic cancer for 8 months, but she'd hidden her illness from me during our weekly visits. She'd continued making the 3-hour drive to see me even as chemotherapy ravaged her body, wearing makeup to hide her pallor and loose clothing to conceal her weight loss. I didn't want you to worry, she explained during our final phone conversation, her voice weak but still filled with the same love that had sustained me through 4 years of imprisonment. You have enough burdens without carrying mine, too. She died on a Thursday afternoon, surrounded by my father and my aunt, while I sat in a concrete cell 200 miles away. The prison chaplain delivered the news with practiced sympathy, but nothing could soften the blow. My mother, my strongest advocate, my most faithful visitor, my connection to the outside world was gone. The request to attend her funeral was denied. Security risk, they said. Insufficient guards available for transport, they claimed. In reality, the prison system didn't care enough about the family connections of convicted murderers to make special arrangements. I learned about my mother's funeral from my father's bitter phone call 3 days later. 200 people came to say goodbye, he told me, his voice hollow with grief and rage. The church was packed. Everyone loved your mother, respected her. But her own son couldn't be there because of what you did. Those last 4 words, because of what you did, cut deeper than any physical wound. My father had finally reached his breaking point. 4 years of stress, of visiting his son in prison, of defending my innocence to neighbors and friends, had eroded his faith in me. Dad, don't, he interrupted. Just don't. Your mother believed in you until the day she died, made me promise to keep visiting you, keep supporting you. But I can't do it anymore, Lucas. I can't pretend that you're innocent when the evidence says otherwise. That was the last conversation I had with my father for 6 years. He stopped visiting, stopped calling, stopped sending money for commissary items. In his grief and exhaustion, he chose to believe that I was guilty rather than continue fighting a system that seemed determined to keep me locked away. Sophie's visits became less frequent, too. She was now 7 years old, old enough to understand that her father lived in a place for bad people, smart enough to ask questions that my mother's sister couldn't answer. The drive was long for a child, and the visiting room was intimidating: metal detectors, guards, the constant tension of incarcerated men desperate to connect with their families. "She's struggling in school," my aunt admitted during one of our brief calls. "The other kids know about you, about where you are. They say things, cruel things that children shouldn't know how to say." I started having nightmares about Sophie, growing up ashamed of her father, embarrassed by my name, telling people that her dad was dead rather than admitting he was in prison for murder. The thought of my daughter learning to lie about me was almost unbearable. The isolation became complete when Raymond Washington died of a heart attack in my 5th year. I found him in our cell after returning from work detail, collapsed beside his bunk with his Bible open to Psalm 23. Raymond had been my mentor, my protector, my link to sanity in an insane place. Without Raymond's guidance and friendship, the prison became a much darker place. I was assigned a new cellmate, a young man named Craig who'd been convicted of armed robbery and spent most of his time complaining about the unfairness of his 5-year sentence. Craig had no interest in mentoring or friendship. He just wanted to serve his time and get back to the streets. I retreated into myself, spending more and more time alone in the law library, researching cases and writing appeal after appeal that went nowhere. I became obsessed with finding legal precedents that might apply to my case, with discovering some procedural error that might warrant a new trial. The depression hit me like a physical illness. Some mornings I couldn't get out of bed, couldn't face another day of the same routine in the same concrete box. The prison psychiatrist prescribed antidepressants, but medication couldn't cure the fundamental problem. I was an innocent man watching his life disappear one day at a time. I started having thoughts that scared me, thoughts about ending the pain permanently, about making sure Sophie wouldn't have to carry the burden of an imprisoned father for the rest of her life. The thoughts came during the darkest moments, usually late at night when the weight of injustice felt unbearable. It was a letter from Sophie that pulled me back from the edge. She was 8 years old now, and her handwriting had improved dramatically. The letter was decorated with stickers and contained a school photo showing a beautiful little girl with my eyes and her mother's smile. "Dear Daddy," the letter read, "I know you're sad because Grandma died and Grandpa doesn't visit anymore. I'm sad too. But I want you to know that I still love you and I still believe you're a good person. My friend Sarah's dad drinks too much and hits her mom, but you're the best daddy in the world even though you can't be here. Please don't give up because I need you to come home someday. Love always, Sophie." I kept that letter under my pillow and read it every night before sleep. It reminded me that someone still believed in me, still needed me, still loved me despite everything. Sophie became my reason to survive, my motivation to keep fighting, my hope for eventual redemption. My GED certificate arrived on a cold February morning in my 6th year of imprisonment, and holding that simple piece of paper felt like winning the lottery. I had earned my high school equivalency through correspondence courses, studying by the dim light of my cell after work detail and spending weekends in the prison library. The certificate represented more than educational achievement. It was proof that I could still grow, still learn, still become something better, despite the concrete walls that confined me. Raymond had been right when he told me I had two choices: let prison break me, or use the time to improve myself. The prison's education coordinator, Mrs. Helen Rodriguez, became my champion. She was a gray-haired woman in her 50s who commuted an hour each way to teach classes at Millbrook, driven by a genuine belief that education could transform lives. When she learned about my situation, she encouraged me to pursue college courses through the prison's partnership with the state university. "You have potential, Lucas," she told me during one of our meetings in the education wing. "Don't let this place define who you are. Use your time here to become the man your daughter can be proud of." College work was challenging in ways I hadn't expected. I was studying alongside men who'd never finished elementary school, trying to write essays, in a noisy environment where privacy was non-existent. My first psychology textbook cost 3 weeks of commissary money. but I treasured it like a precious artifact. The coursework opened my mind to concepts I'd never considered. I learned about criminal justice theory, about the psychological factors that lead to crime, about the systemic problems that create cycles of poverty and incarceration. Most importantly, I learned about wrongful convictions and the flaws in the justice system that had destroyed my life. I discovered that my case wasn't unique. Hundreds of innocent people had been convicted based on false testimony, prosecutorial misconduct, and inadequate defense representation. Organizations like the Innocence Project were working to free wrongfully convicted prisoners, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of cases. My first college essay was about the psychology of false confessions. I interviewed other inmates who'd confessed to crimes they hadn't committed, trying to understand the mental pressure that could lead someone to admit guilt for something they didn't do. The research helped me understand Tyler's decision to implicate me. He wasn't necessarily evil, just desperate and selfish. Teaching GED classes became my calling within the prison walls. Many of the men I worked with had been failed by the education system long before they'd been failed by the criminal justice system. They came from broken homes, underfunded schools, neighborhoods where survival took priority over learning. Marcus Thompson was 19 when he arrived at Millbrook, barely literate despite having attended school through 10th grade. He'd been convicted of drug trafficking, sentenced to 8 years for selling crack cocaine to support his family after his mother lost her job. Marcus was angry, defensive, and convinced that education was a waste of time for someone like him. "What's the point?" he asked during our first tutoring session. "I'm black, I'm poor, and I got a record. Ain't no college gonna want me when I get out." I worked with Marcus for 2 years, slowly building his confidence along with his reading skills. We started with simple books, moved to newspapers, eventually tackled more complex texts. When Marcus passed his GED exam, scoring higher than the state average, he cried right there in the testing room. "You changed my life, Mr. Bennett," he told me afterward. "Before I met you, I thought I was just another street thug. Now I know I can be something better." Stories like Marcus's gave my imprisonment meaning beyond my own suffering. I couldn't change my situation, couldn't undo Tyler's lies or reclaim my lost years, but I could help other men discover their potential and break the cycles that had led them to prison. I started keeping a journal, documenting the stories of men I'd taught and the progress they'd made. Some went on to earn college degrees while incarcerated. Others used their education to find legitimate work after release. A few, like Marcus, became advocates for criminal justice reform and prison education programs. Sophie's letters became more sophisticated as she entered middle school. She wrote about her classes, her friends, her dreams of becoming a teacher like the woman who'd inspired her love of reading. She sent me her report card, straight A's semester after semester, and copies of essays she'd written for school. One essay titled "My Hero" was about me. Sophie wrote about her father, who was wrongfully imprisoned but never gave up hope, who used his time behind bars to help other people learn and grow. Reading her words, I realized that my decision to pursue education and help others had given Sophie something to be proud of, a way to understand her father's absence as something meaningful rather than shameful. The prison's warden, a progressive administrator named Patricia Brooks, took notice of the education program's success. She invited me to join the prison's reform committee, a group of inmates and staff who work together to improve conditions and reduce recidivism rates. "You've shown that prison can be a place of growth rather than just punishment," Warden Brooks told me during our first committee meeting. "Your work with the education program is changing lives, and I want to expand it." For the first time since my conviction, I felt like I was making a real difference. I wasn't just serving time, I was using time productively, helping other men discover their potential and preparing them for successful re-entry into society. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. I had found my calling as an educator and advocate, while imprisoned for a crime I didn't commit. The injustice that had destroyed my freedom had also revealed strengths and passions I might never have discovered on the outside. Sophie's high school graduation photo arrived in a manila envelope during my 10th year of imprisonment, and seeing her in that cap and gown was both the proudest and most heartbreaking moment of my incarceration. She had grown into a beautiful, young woman, tall and graceful like her mother. But with my stubborn chin and determined eyes, the photo was accompanied by a copy of her valedictorian speech, delivered to an auditorium filled with families celebrating their children's achievements. I read it alone in my cell, tears streaming down my face as I imagined the daughter I'd been forced to raise through letters and brief phone calls standing at a podium, addressing her graduating class. My father always told me that education is the one thing no one can take away from you, Sophie had said in her speech. He taught me that knowledge is power, that learning opens doors, that books can take you anywhere you want to go. My father couldn't be here tonight, but his lessons shaped who I've become, and I carry his wisdom with me as I start the next chapter of my life. Sophie had somehow managed to honor me publicly without revealing the reason for my absence. She'd learned to navigate the complexity of having an incarcerated father with grace and dignity that amazed me. The teenage years had been particularly challenging for both of us. Sophie was old, enough to understand the weight of my conviction, smart, enough to research the details of my case, and mature enough to form her own opinions about my guilt or innocence. The visits during this period were emotionally charged, filled with difficult conversations about justice, truth, and the price of being different. "The kids at school call you a murderer," Sophie had told me during a visit when she was 14. Her voice steady, but her eyes filled with pain. "They say terrible things about our family. Sometimes I want to fight them, but then I remember what you taught me about violence never solving anything." I watched my daughter struggle with the burden of my reputation throughout her teenage years. She was academically gifted, socially mature, and naturally popular, but the shadow of my conviction followed her everywhere. Some parents wouldn't let their children visit our house. Some teachers treated her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Some classmates used my imprisonment as ammunition during adolescent conflicts, but Sophie developed a strength that astounded me. Instead of hiding from my situation, she chose to research wrongful convictions for her senior project. She interviewed other families affected by the criminal justice system, studied cases where innocent people had been exonerated, and presented her findings to a panel of judges and attorneys. "I may not be able to prove my father's innocence," she concluded in her presentation, "but I can work to prevent other families from experiencing what we've been through. The system that convicted my father has flaws, and those flaws destroy lives." Her project earned state recognition and a scholarship to the state university, where she planned to study criminal justice and social work. The scholarship money would cover her entire education, a blessing. Since I obviously couldn't contribute to her college expenses from prison, the visits became less frequent as Sophie got older. Not because she loved me less, but because life was pulling her in so many directions. She had part-time jobs, extracurricular activities, college preparations, and a social life that didn't revolve around her imprisoned father. I understood her need for independence, but each missed visit felt like another small death. I was watching my daughter grow up through glimpses and snapshots, missing the daily interactions that build real relationships between parents and children. When Sophie started dating, she called to tell me about a boy named Andrew who'd asked her to prom. "He knows about you," she said, her voice careful and measured. "I told him the truth about everything. He said it doesn't matter to him, that he judges people by their actions, not their circumstances." I was grateful that Sophie had found someone who could see past my conviction, but I also mourned the fact that I couldn't meet this young man, couldn't have the protective father conversation that should have been my right and responsibility. The prom photos showed Sophie in an elegant blue dress, radiant with happiness, standing next to a young man who seemed genuinely devoted to her. But there was an empty space in those photos where I should have been, taking pictures and embarrassing her with parental protectiveness. Sophie's acceptance to college brought mixed emotions. I was incredibly proud of her academic achievements and excited about her future opportunities. But I was also devastated by the realization that she was moving on with her life while I remained frozen in the same concrete cell. "I'm going to study criminal justice," she told me during our last visit before she left for college. "I'm going to learn everything I can about wrongful convictions and legal advocacy. I don't know if I can help you specifically, but maybe I can help other families like ours." Her decision to dedicate her education to understanding the system that had torn our family apart was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Sophie was turning her pain into purpose, her trauma into a tool for helping others. The letters from college painted a picture of a young woman flourishing academically and socially. Sophie made the dean's list every semester, joined the debate team, and volunteered with a local legal aid organization. She was building the life I'd always dreamed she would have, despite the obstacles my conviction had placed in her path. But I could sense the loneliness in her letters too. Sophie had learned to be independent out of necessity, to rely on herself because her father wasn't available for guidance and support. She'd grown up faster than she should have, carrying burdens that no child should bear. One letter particularly moved me. "I love you, Dad, and I believe in your innocence completely. But sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if you'd been here. Would I have been more carefree? Would I have worried less about money and reputation and what people think?" I try not to dwell on the what-ifs, but sometimes they creep. And despite my best efforts, I realized that my wrongful conviction hadn't just stolen my freedom, it had stolen Sophie's childhood innocence, her sense of security, her right to have a normal father-daughter relationship. She'd been forced to grow up in the shadow of injustice, and no amount of love or pride could fully compensate for that loss. The Innocence Project application arrived like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. I'd learned about the organization through a fellow inmate named Jerome Washington, who'd been corresponding with lawyers about his own wrongful conviction case for armed robbery. "They help people like us," Jerome explained during our conversation in the prison yard. "People who got railroaded by the system, convicted on bad evidence or lying witnesses. They use DNA testing and legal expertise to prove innocence." I'd heard of DNA testing, of course, but in my 12 years of imprisonment, the technology had seemed like something from science fiction rather than a practical for proving innocence. The idea that genetic material could definitively establish whether someone had been present at a crime scene was revolutionary. The application process was exhaustive and intimidating. The Innocence Project received thousands of requests for help each year but could only take on a small percentage of cases. They prioritized death penalty cases and situations where DNA evidence was likely to be available in conclusive. My case seemed like a long shot. There had been no sexual assault, no obvious source of DNA evidence from the perpetrator. The security footage showed masked figures, and the murder weapon had never been recovered. But I had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by trying. I spent 3 months crafting my application, drawing on everything I'd learned during my years of legal research. I outlined the weaknesses in the prosecution's case, the lack of physical evidence, Tyler's obvious motive to lie, the inadequacy of my legal representation, and the inconsistencies in the state's timeline. "I am writing to request your assistance in proving my innocence of a murder I did not commit," my application began. "For 12 years, I have maintained my innocence while serving a life sentence for the killing of Harold Winters. I believe that DNA testing and competent legal representation can finally reveal the truth and restore my freedom." I detailed Tyler's testimony and the deal he'd received in exchange for implicating me. I explained how my court-appointed attorney had failed to adequately challenge Tyler's credibility or present alternative theories of the crime. I provided a timeline of my activities on the night of the murder and explained why the cell phone evidence had been misinterpreted. Most importantly, I suggested potential sources of DNA evidence that hadn't been tested during the original investigation. The cigarettes taken from Harold's store might contain saliva from the real perpetrator. The cash register and door handles might preserve fingerprints or skin cells. Even the security camera itself might have been touched by someone other than Harold. The waiting was agony. For 18 months, I heard nothing from the Innocence Project except an automated acknowledgement that my application had been received. During that time, I continued my education work and tried to maintain hope, but the silence was deafening. When the letter finally arrived, I was almost afraid to open it. I'd been disappointed so many times before by appeals courts, by journalists, by anyone I'd hoped might investigate my case. But this letter was different. "Dear Mr. Bennett," it read, "after careful review of your case, The Innocence Project has decided to investigate your claims of innocence. We believe there are significant questions about your conviction that warrant further examination. I must have read that paragraph 20 times, hardly believing the words on the page. For the first time in 12 years, someone with real legal expertise and resources was taking my case seriously. The letter was signed by Jennifer Walsh, a staff attorney who would become my advocate and eventually my friend. She outlined the next steps, reviewing the trial transcripts, examining the physical evidence, and determining what DNA testing might be possible. Please understand that acceptance for investigation does not guarantee exoneration, the letter cautioned. Our process is thorough and can take several years. We will only proceed if we believe we can prove your innocence definitively. I called Sophie immediately with the news. She was in her junior year of college, studying for finals, but she dropped everything to talk to me. "Dad, this is incredible," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "I've been researching the Innocence Project for one of my classes. They've freed hundreds of innocent people. They have the best lawyers and investigators in the country. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel genuine hope. The Innocence Project had a track record of success, resources I could never access on my own, and a reputation that commanded respect from courts and prosecutors. Jennifer Walsh visited me 6 weeks later, accompanied by a paralegal and an investigator. She was a woman in her 30s with short brown hair and intense eyes that seemed to take in every detail. During our 4-hour meeting, she asked questions that no one had ever bothered to ask during my original trial. "Tell me about your relationship with Tyler Blackwood," she began. "Not just the basic facts, but the emotional dynamics. What kind of person was he? What motivated him? Why would he implicate you specifically?" I explained Tyler's background, his family troubles, his descent into drug addiction, and his pattern of manipulating situations to his advantage. I described our friendship in high school and how it had deteriorated as we chose different paths. In life, Tyler was always charming, I told her. He could convince anyone of anything, but he was also desperate and selfish. When he was facing life in prison, he would have said anything to save himself. Jennifer took detailed notes, asking follow-up questions that showed she understood the psychological dynamics of false testimony. She wasn't just looking at legal technicalities. She was trying to understand the human factors that had led to my wrongful conviction. "We're going to start by having the physical evidence retested," she explained. "DNA technology has advanced significantly since 1999. We might be able to extract genetic material from items that couldn't be tested during your original trial." The meeting ended with Jennifer shaking my hand and promising to stay in touch throughout the investigation. For the first time in 12 years, I felt like someone was truly fighting for me. Someone with the skills and resources to challenge the system that had failed me so completely. The DNA test results arrived on a Tuesday morning in my 14th year of imprisonment, delivered by Jennifer Walsh during what should have been a triumphant visit. Instead, her face showed the complex mixture of vindication and frustration that would characterize the next phase of my case. "The results are exactly what we hoped for," she told me, sliding the laboratory report across the metal table. "Your DNA is nowhere on any of the evidence. You weren't at that crime scene, Lucas. We can prove it scientifically." The report was 8 pages of technical analysis that essentially boiled down to one crucial finding. Genetic material recovered from the cigarette pack and cash register belonged to Harold Winters and an unknown male, but definitely not to me. After 14 years of proclaiming my innocence, I finally had scientific proof. "This should be enough to get you out," I said, my hands shaking as I held the report. "This proves I wasn't there." Jennifer's expression was cautious. "It should be enough, but the legal system doesn't always work the way it should. DNA evidence is powerful, but it's not automatically grounds for immediate release. We have to navigate a complex appeals process." The first obstacle was the statute of limitations for presenting new evidence. In our state, DNA evidence had to be filed within 2 years of its discovery, but there were additional requirements about why the evidence hadn't been tested during the original trial and whether it would have changed the outcome. The prosecutor's office is fighting us, Jennifer explained during a follow-up call. They're arguing that the DNA evidence doesn't prove your innocence because Tyler's testimony established that you were the getaway driver, not the person who actually entered the store. This legal maneuvering was maddening. The prosecution was essentially arguing that I could be guilty of murder even though I was provably not present at the crime scene. They were clinging to Tyler's lies rather than acknowledging the obvious. If I wasn't at the store, then Tyler's entire story was fabricated. The media began paying attention to my case for the first time since my conviction. A local television reporter named Michael Torres did a series of investigative stories about wrongful convictions, featuring my case as a prime example of systemic failures. DNA evidence exonerates local man after 14 years, read the headline, in the city newspaper. The article included quotes from Jennifer Walsh about the strength of the scientific evidence and criticism of the prosecutor's office for their resistance to acknowledging obvious innocence. Sophie was featured in one of the television segments, now a poised college senior who spoke eloquently about the impact of wrongful conviction on families. My father has spent 14 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, she said, looking directly into the camera. We now have scientific proof of his innocence. How much more evidence does the system need? Public opinion began shifting in my favor, but the legal process moved with glacial slowness. Jennifer filed motion after motion. Each one met with procedural objections from the prosecutor's office. They seemed more interested in protecting their conviction record than in ensuring justice. The breakthrough came when Jennifer's investigator located the original crime scene technician, now retired, who admitted that several pieces of evidence had been improperly preserved. Items that should have been refrigerated were stored at room temperature. Chain of custody documentation was incomplete. Some evidence had been contaminated by improper handling. The DNA evidence we have is actually stronger than it should be, Jennifer explained. Despite the poor preservation, we still recovered genetic material that definitively excludes you. Imagine what we might have found if the evidence had been handled properly. Meanwhile, Tyler Blackwood had been released from prison after serving his 15-year sentence. He'd kept a low profile, apparently living with relatives and working construction jobs under an assumed name. Jennifer's investigator had located him, but he refused to speak with them. He won't talk to us, Jennifer reported. He's not legally required to, and obviously he has no incentive to admit he lied during your trial. But we're documenting his current life, his continued denials, his refusal to cooperate with our investigation. The court hearings were exercises in legal frustration. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to the detective who'd arrested me, seemed sympathetic to our arguments but was constrained by arcane procedural rules about post-conviction appeals. Mr. Bennett, the DNA evidence is certainly compelling, she said during one hearing. But this court must consider whether new evidence could have been discovered through due diligence during the original trial, and whether it would have materially affected the outcome. Jennifer argued passionately that DNA testing technology simply hadn't been available in 1999, that my original attorney had been incompetent to request such testing, and that the results definitively proved my innocence. The prosecutor countered that Tyler's testimony about my role as an accessory made the DNA evidence irrelevant. The legal wrangling continued for 2 more years. During that time, I tried to maintain hope while watching other Innocence Project clients gain their freedom. Some cases were resolved quickly when prosecutors acknowledged obvious errors. Others, like mine, became prolonged battles between truth and institutional stubbornness. Sophie graduated from college with honors and was accepted to law school with a full scholarship. I'm going to become the lawyer you should have had, she told me during her graduation visit. I'm going to learn everything about criminal appeals and wrongful convictions. The DNA evidence had given us scientific proof of my innocence, but it had also revealed the terrifying reality that proof alone wasn't enough. The system that had wrongfully convicted me was now fighting desperately to avoid admitting its mistake. Even in the face of conclusive evidence, I began to understand that my exoneration would require more than just proof. It would require Tyler's conscience to finally overcome his self-preservation instincts. And after 16 years of maintaining his lie, that seemed less likely than ever. Tyler Blackwood's medical records would later reveal that his terminal cancer diagnosis came on a rainy Thursday in October, during my 18th year of imprisonment. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, the same disease that had killed my mother. The doctors gave him 6 months to live, maybe 8 if he was lucky. Tyler was 42 years old, looking at least a decade older thanks to years of drug abuse and the hard living that had defined his life since leaving prison. He'd managed to stay out of trouble during his 4 years of freedom, working construction jobs under the name Tyler Brooks and living in a small apartment across town from where we'd grown up, according to his ex-girlfriend Lisa Moreau, who would later speak to reporters. Tyler had been a broken man since his release. He drank heavily, had nightmares that kept him awake at night, and carried a guilt that seemed to consume him from the inside. He used to talk in his sleep, Lisa told a television interviewer months later. He'd say things like, "I'm sorry, Lucas," and "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." And when I'd ask him about it, he'd clam up and start drinking again. The news of my DNA exoneration had been covered extensively in local media, and Tyler couldn't escape the coverage. Every news report about my case was a reminder of the lie he'd been living for nearly 20 years. Friends and coworkers who knew about his past would ask questions. "Wasn't that the guy you testified against? How do you explain the DNA evidence?" Tyler's response was always the same. The DNA didn't matter because I hadn't entered the store. I'd been the getaway driver. But even he seemed to know how hollow that explanation sounded. The turning point came when Tyler saw Sophie on the evening news. Now, a law student speaking at a conference about wrongful convictions. She was 23 years old, beautiful, and articulate, talking about growing up with an imprisoned father and dedicating her life to criminal justice reform. "My father has been in prison for 18 years for a crime he didn't commit," Sophie said during the interview. "We have scientific proof of his innocence, but the system refuses to acknowledge its mistake. Every day he remains imprisoned is another day of injustice, another piece of my family that's been stolen." Lisa later described Tyler's reaction to seeing Sophie on television. "He'd been drinking beer and watching the news when my daughter's segment came on. As Sophie spoke about the impact of wrongful conviction on families, Tyler began crying, not the tears of someone feeling sorry for himself, but the deep, gut-wrenching sobs of a man confronting the full weight of his actions. "She looks just like him," Tyler had said through his tears. "That little girl grew up without her father because of what I did. Jesus Christ, what have I done?" The cancer diagnosis 3 weeks later seemed to break the last of Tyler's psychological defenses. Facing his own mortality, the lie he'd been living for 20 years became unbearable. He started drinking more heavily, stopped showing up to work, and began talking about needing to make things right before he died. Tyler's estrangement from his own children added another layer of guilt. His son Marcus was in prison for drug trafficking, following the same destructive path Tyler had walked. His daughter Christina had cut off contact years earlier. Ashamed of her father's criminal past and unwilling to expose her own children to his influence. "He used to say that he'd ruined his kids' lives," Lisa remembered. He'd talk about how Marcus learned to lie and steal by watching him, how Christina was embarrassed to have his name. Then he'd start talking about Lucas and how he'd destroyed another family. The first phone call to Jennifer Walsh came on a Tuesday evening in November. Tyler was drunk, rambling, but coherent enough to express what he needed to say. "I need to talk to someone about the Lucas Bennett case," he told Jennifer's assistant. "I have information that could help him." Jennifer was skeptical. She'd dealt with false confessions before, with mentally ill people who claimed responsibility for crimes they hadn't committed. But something about Tyler's call seemed different, more desperate than delusional, more guilty than grandiose. The second call came 3 days later, this time during business hours when Tyler was sober. His voice was steady but filled with an exhaustion that went beyond physical illness. "My name is Tyler Blackwood," he said. "I was Lucas Bennett's supposed accomplice. I need to tell someone the truth before I die." Jennifer agreed to meet with Tyler, but only with conditions. The conversation would be recorded. It would take place with witnesses present. And Tyler would have to acknowledge that any confession could be used in legal proceedings. Tyler agreed to everything. He was beyond caring about consequences for himself. The cancer would handle his punishment more thoroughly than any court ever could. The meeting took place in Jennifer's office on a gray December morning. Tyler arrived looking skeletal, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost 40 pounds to cancer and chemotherapy. But his eyes were clear and focused in a way they probably hadn't been for years. "I want to start by saying that Lucas Bennett never committed any crime," Tyler began, his voice recorded for posterity. "He was never at Harold's store, never planned any robbery, never knew anything about what I was going to do. Every word I said during his trial was a lie." Jennifer listened as Tyler dismantled 20 years of false testimony, piece by piece. He explained how he'd acted alone, how he'd been desperate for drug money, how he'd chosen Harold's store because he knew the old man wouldn't fight back. "I shot Harold twice," Tyler confessed, his voice breaking. "The first shot killed him, but I was so scared and high that I shot him again. Then I grabbed the money and those cigarettes and ran. I was stupid and panicked, and I killed a good man for $340. The most devastating part of Tyler's confession was his explanation of why he'd implicated me. Facing life in prison under the three strikes law, Tyler had needed a story that would save his life. I had been the perfect patsy, someone he knew well enough to lie about convincingly. Someone without an alibi, someone who'd be hard for a jury to sympathize with. "I knew everything about Lucas's life," Tyler admitted. "I knew about his money problems, his schedule, his personality. I could make up conversations that sounded real because I knew how he talked, what he cared about, what would motivate him." Tyler also revealed how the police had inadvertently helped him craft his lies. During interrogation, they'd shared details about the crime scene, suggested theories about planning and motivation, and essentially coached him on how to make his story more believable. "They wanted to solve the case," Tyler explained. "When I gave them Lucas's name, they stopped investigating and started building a prosecution. They helped me fill in the details that made my lies sound true." The confession session lasted 4 hours, with Tyler providing details that only the real killer would know, details that had never been released to the public or mentioned during my trial. He knew exactly how Harold had fallen, where the cash register had been positioned, what Harold had been wearing that night. Most importantly, Tyler provided the location where he'd disposed of the murder weapon. 20 years later, the gun was likely gone forever. But Tyler's knowledge of its hiding place was another piece of evidence that corroborated his confession. As the session ended, Tyler made one final statement that Jennifer would never forget. "I've spent 20 years watching an innocent man rot in prison for my crime. I can't undo what I did to Harold Winters, but maybe I can finally free Lucas Bennett. It's the only decent thing I've done in my entire miserable life." Tyler's recorded confession became the most important document in my case, but it also opened a legal labyrinth that would test everyone's patience for justice. Jennifer Walsh knew that Tyler's admission of perjury was explosive evidence, but she also understood that deathbed confessions can be legally complicated, especially when they contradict 20 years of established court record. The confession was comprehensive and devastating. Over the course of 2 more recorded sessions, Tyler provided a minute-by-minute account of March 14, 1999, that bore no resemblance to the story he'd told during my trial. "I was coming down from a 3-day meth binge," Tyler began during the second session. "I hadn't eaten in 2 days, hadn't slept properly in a week. I needed money for drugs, and I was desperate enough to do anything to get it." Tyler explained that he'd chosen Harold's store after watching it for several nights, noting that the old man often worked alone during late hours and that the store was isolated enough to avoid immediate detection. He'd planned what he thought would be a simple robbery: get in, get the money, get out. "I never meant to kill Harold," Tyler said, his voice thick with genuine remorse. "I brought the gun to scare him, to make sure he'd cooperate. But when I got inside, something went wrong. Harold was calm, too calm. He was looking at me like he was memorizing my face, like he was planning to identify me later. The killing had been impulsive and panicked. Tyler had demanded money from the register, and Harold had complied without resistance. But when Harold had asked Tyler if he was the Blackwood boy who used to come in here with his mother, Tyler had realized that his mask wasn't hiding his identity as well as he'd hoped. He recognized me, Tyler confessed. Even with the mask, Harold knew who I was. I panicked and shot him. Then I shot him again because I was terrified and high and not thinking straight. It was the worst moment of my life, and I've relived it every day for 20 years. After the shooting, Tyler had grabbed the money and cigarettes and fled to his apartment, where he disposed of his bloody clothes and hidden the gun. He planned to lie low and hope the police would never connect him to the crime, but Tyler had been arrested 2 days later on unrelated drug charges, and suddenly he was facing life in prison under the habitual offender statute. That's when desperation had led him to fabricate the story about my involvement. I knew they'd want a bigger fish, Tyler explained. One junkie robbing a store wasn't going to satisfy anyone, but if I could give them a mastermind, someone who'd planned the whole thing, then I'd be valuable to them. Tyler revealed how he'd crafted his lies using intimate knowledge of my life and personality. He knew about my financial struggles, my work schedule, my relationship with Sophie. He could invent conversations that sounded authentic because he understood how I thought and spoke. I made Lucas into the perfect criminal mastermind, Tyler admitted. Smart enough to plan the robbery, desperate enough to need the money, cold enough to order a killing. None of it was true, but it was believable because I knew how to make it sound real. The most chilling part of Tyler's confession was his description of how easily the police had accepted his lies. Once he'd given them my name, they'd stopped investigating other possibilities and focused entirely on building a case against me. They wanted it to be true, Tyler said. They had pressure to solve Harold's murder, and I was giving them exactly what they needed. They helped me fill in details, suggested motives, even coached me on how to testify convincingly. Tyler also revealed information that had never come out during my trial. He admitted that the cell phone calls between us had nothing to do with planning a robbery. I'd been refusing to lend him money for drugs, which is why the calls had been so brief. Lucas was trying to help me get clean, Tyler confessed. He'd given me $50 in February for what I said was job interview clothes, but I spent it on meth. When I kept calling for more money, he told me he couldn't enable my addiction anymore. He was being a good friend, and I repaid him by destroying his life. Jennifer recorded every detail, understanding that Tyler's confession needed to be airtight and comprehensive. She asked about inconsistencies in his original testimony, about evidence that had seemed to support the prosecution's case, about why he'd waited 20 years to tell the truth. I was a coward, Tyler answered simply. I was terrified of going to prison for life, so I let an innocent man take my punishment. Then, as the years went by, it became easier to live with the lie than to face the truth about what I'd done. Tyler's deteriorating health added urgency to the confession process. He was undergoing chemotherapy that left him weak and nauseous, and his doctors had revised his prognosis downward. He might have 3 months left, not 6, during the final confession session. Tyler provided one piece of information that could potentially corroborate his story. He revealed that he'd hidden the murder weapon in a drainage pipe near the railroad tracks, about 2 miles from Harold's store. I threw the gun down a storm drain on Maple Street, Tyler said. It might still be there, rusted to hell, but maybe your investigators can find it. Maybe there's still DNA or fingerprints that could prove I was the only one who touched it. Jennifer immediately dispatched an investigator to search the area Tyler had described. The chances of finding a gun after 20 years were slim, but any physical evidence that corroborated Tyler's confession would strengthen the case for my exoneration. As Tyler's confession sessions concluded, Jennifer faced the challenge of presenting this evidence to a legal system that had already invested 20 years in maintaining my conviction. Tyler's admission of perjury was devastating to the prosecution's case, but it also meant acknowledging that police, prosecutors, and courts had all been complicit in a massive miscarriage of justice. This confession changes everything, Jennifer told me during a phone call after Tyler's final session. We now have a complete admission of guilt from the real perpetrator, supported by details that only the killer would know. Combined with the DNA evidence, this should be enough to secure your immediate release. But Jennifer's optimism was tempered by realism about how the system works. Exonerating me would require admitting that dozens of officials had been wrong. For 20 years, that an innocent man had been imprisoned while the real killer walked free, that the justice system had failed catastrophically. "We're not just fighting for your freedom," Jennifer explained. "We're challenging the system's ability to admit when it makes mistakes. That's going to be the real battle." The news headlines began appearing on a Tuesday morning in January. 20 years after my wrongful conviction, real killer confesses, innocent man spent 2 decades in prison. Within hours, my case had become national news, spreading across social media and cable networks as an example of everything wrong with the American justice system. Jennifer Walsh had coordinated the media strategy carefully, releasing Tyler's confession and the DNA evidence simultaneously to maximize impact. She understood that public pressure would be crucial in forcing the prosecutor's office to acknowledge what had become undeniably obvious. I was innocent. The lead story on Channel 7 News showed reporter Michael Torres standing outside Millbrook Correctional Facility, explaining how Tyler Blackwood's deathbed confession had finally revealed the truth about Harold Winter's murder. The report included audio excerpts from Tyler's recorded statements, his admission that I had never been involved in planning or executing the crime. "For 20 years, Lucas Bennett has maintained his innocence from behind prison walls," Torres reported. "Now we know he was telling the truth. Tyler Blackwood, the man whose testimony convicted Bennett, has admitted to lying under oath and committing the murder alone." The story gained momentum throughout the day as other media outlets picked it up. By evening, my case was being discussed on national news programs, with legal experts analyzing the implications of Tyler's confession and the DNA evidence that had already proven my innocence. Public reaction was swift and overwhelmingly supportive. Social media exploded with outrage about my wrongful conviction, with hashtags like #FreeLucasBennett and #JusticeDelayed trending nationally. People shared the story with angry comments about prosecutorial misconduct and systemic failures, but the response that mattered most came from an unexpected source: Harold Winter's daughter, Margaret Winters Hoffman, who issued a statement through her attorney that shocked everyone involved in the case. "Our family has spent 20 years believing that justice had been served for our father's murder," Margaret's statement read. "Learning that Mr. Bennett was innocent, that the real killer was free while an innocent man suffered in prison, is devastating to us. We call on the prosecutor's office to immediately correct this terrible injustice." Her statement continued, "Mr. Bennett has lost 20 years of his life for a crime he didn't commit. His daughter grew up without her father because of lies and incompetence. We are horrified that our pursuit of justice led to such a massive injustice, and we will do everything in our power to support Mr. Bennett's immediate release." Margaret's public support was a game-changer. The prosecution could no longer argue that acknowledging my innocence would somehow dishonor Harold's memory. His own family was demanding my exoneration. The prosecutor's office found itself in an impossible position. District Attorney Catherine Ross, who had prosecuted my case 20 years earlier, was now facing the biggest crisis of her career. She called a press conference for Thursday afternoon, and speculation ran wild about what she might announce. I watched the press conference from the prison library, surrounded by inmates and guards who had followed my case for years. Ross looked uncomfortable as she approached the podium, flanked by assistants and legal advisors. After reviewing new evidence in the Lucas Bennett case, including DNA testing and recent statements by Tyler Blackwood, our office is conducting a thorough investigation, Ross announced. We take any claims of wrongful conviction seriously and will ensure that justice is served. It wasn't the immediate acknowledgement of innocence that Jennifer had hoped for, but it was a significant shift from the prosecutor's previous stance. Ross was clearly buying time, trying to figure out how to handle the political and legal implications of admitting such a massive error. The press conference became contentious. When reporters began asking pointed questions about prosecutorial misconduct and the office's resistance to DNA evidence, Miss Ross, you've had definitive DNA evidence of Mr. Bennett's innocence for 3 years, one reporter asked. Why has it taken Tyler Blackwood's confession for your office to take this case seriously? Ross's answer was evasive and legalistic, full of references to proper procedures and thorough review processes. But her discomfort was obvious, and her non-answers only fueled more public outrage. Sophie's interview that evening was the most powerful moment of the entire media blitz. She appeared on the national news looking poised and articulate, speaking as both a daughter who'd lost her father to wrongful conviction and as a law student who understood the systemic failures that had occurred. My father has been in prison for my entire adult life, Sophie said, looking directly into the camera. I've visited him in that concrete box every month for 20 years, watching him maintain his dignity and innocence while the system that wrongfully convicted him refused to admit its mistakes. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. Tyler Blackwood's confession doesn't just prove my father's innocence, it proves that our justice system is fundamentally broken. How many other innocent people are rotting in prison while the real criminals walk free? How many families have been destroyed by prosecutorial arrogance and police incompetence? The interviewer asked Sophie about forgiveness, about whether she harbored anger toward Tyler or the officials who had wrongfully convicted me. I'm not angry with Tyler Blackwood, Sophie replied, surprising many viewers. He was a drug addict, facing life in prison who made a desperate, terrible decision. I'm angry with a system that accepted his lies without proper investigation, that fought to maintain a wrongful conviction even when presented with DNA evidence, that cares more about protecting its reputation than about serving justice. The media coverage had its intended effect. By Friday, protesters had gathered outside the prosecutor's office demanding my immediate release. Legal experts on television were calling my case a textbook example of everything wrong with the criminal justice system. More importantly, the political pressure was becoming unbearable for Ross and her office, with Harold's family supporting my exoneration with overwhelming public outcry, and with Tyler's confession providing undeniable proof of my innocence. Maintaining my conviction had become politically impossible. Jennifer received the call she'd been waiting for on Friday afternoon. The prosecutor's office was ready to discuss terms for my release, but they wanted to negotiate the details privately rather than admit wrongdoing publicly. They're trying to save face, Jennifer explained during our phone call. They want to release you without admitting that they prosecuted an innocent man. They're proposing language about new evidence and changed circumstances, rather than acknowledging prosecutorial error. I didn't care about their face-saving measures. After 20 years in prison, I just wanted to go home to my daughter. The truth was finally out there for the world to see, and that was more important than any official admission of guilt from the people who had wrongfully convicted me. The world now knew that I was innocent, that Tyler had lied, that the system had failed catastrophically. Public opinion had shifted completely in my favor, and political pressure was mounting for my immediate release. After 2 decades of fighting for justice, victory was finally within reach. My first paycheck as a free man was for $847.50, earned during 2 weeks of training at a non-profit organization that helped formerly incarcerated people reintegrate into society. The check was modest, but holding it in my hands felt like holding a piece of my humanity that had been stolen 20 years earlier. Freedom came officially on February 14, 2024, Valentine's Day, which Sophie later said was perfect because it represented love finally triumphing over injustice. The prosecutor's office had agreed to vacate my conviction in light of new evidence, avoiding any admission of wrongdoing while finally acknowledging what everyone already knew. I was innocent. The moment I walked out of Millbrook Correctional Facility was surreal. Jennifer Walsh was waiting with Sophie, now 27 years old and more beautiful than any father could have imagined. We embraced for the first time in 20 years without a table between us, without guards watching, without time limits. "Welcome back to the world, Dad," Sophie whispered, tears streaming down both our faces. The world I re-entered was almost unrecognizable from the one I'd left in 1999. Everyone carried computers in their pockets. called them smartphones, and seemed to live their lives through screens. Cars looked different, stores had changed, technology had advanced in ways that made me feel like a time traveler. Simple tasks that had once been automatic became challenges. Using an ATM required learning new procedures. Grocery stores had self-checkout machines that confused me. Even television remote controls had evolved beyond my understanding. Sophie helped me navigate this new landscape with patience and humor. She found me a small apartment near the university where she was finishing law school, furnished it with basic necessities, and spent hours teaching me about social media, email, and other technologies that had become essential for modern life. The adjustment was harder than I'd expected. Prison had imposed structure on every moment of my day for 20 years. Suddenly having choices, what to eat, where to go, when to sleep, was overwhelming. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. out of habit, then lie in bed unsure what to do with the freedom to stay there. The civil lawsuit against the city and police department became my primary focus during those first months of freedom. Jennifer had connected me with a team of attorneys who specialized in wrongful conviction cases, led by a brilliant lawyer named Sarah Chun, who'd won several multi-million-dollar settlements for exonerated clients. "Your case is particularly strong," Sarah explained during our first meeting. "We have Tyler's confession, DNA evidence, and 20 years of documented prosecutorial resistance to obvious innocence. The city's liability is clear and their conduct was egregious." The lawsuit sought $50 million in damages, $2.5 million for each year of wrongful imprisonment. It alleged violations of my constitutional rights, prosecutorial misconduct, police negligence, and deliberate indifference to evidence of innocence, but the legal process moved slowly and I needed income immediately. The nonprofit organization where I'd found work, called Second Chances, specialized in helping exonerees and other formerly incarcerated people rebuild their lives. My job involved peer counseling, helping newly released men navigate the challenges of reintegration. "You understand what they're going through in ways that no social worker ever could," explained Dr. Patricia Williams, the organization's director. "Your experience, your education, your ability to maintain hope despite 20 years of injustice, these are exactly the qualities we need." Working with other formerly incarcerated men gave my freedom purpose beyond personal vindication. I met people who'd served time for crimes they'd actually committed, who struggled with addiction, mental illness, and the stigma of criminal records. Many of them looked up to me as proof that redemption was possible. Marcus Thompson, the young man I'd tutored in prison, had been released 6 months before me and was working as a community organizer. He'd earned his bachelor's degree while incarcerated, and was now helping other young men avoid the mistakes that had led him to prison. "You saved my life in there, Mr. Bennett," Marcus told me during our first meeting as free men. "Not just with the education, but by showing me that a man could maintain his dignity even in the worst circumstances." Sophie's graduation from law school was one of the most profound moments of my new freedom. I sat in the audience watching my daughter receive her Juris Doctor degree, thinking about all the milestones I'd missed, but grateful beyond words to be present for this one. During her graduation speech as class valedictorian, Sophie spoke about justice delayed and the importance of fighting for the truth even when the system resists it. "My father spent 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit," she told her graduating class. "His exoneration didn't happen because the system worked, it happened because dedicated people refused to accept injustice." As we begin our careers as lawyers, we have a responsibility to be those dedicated people, to fight for truth even when it's difficult, expensive, or unpopular. The settlement negotiations with the city were contentious. Their attorneys argued that $50 million was excessive, that some of my suffering had been self-imposed by refusing to admit guilt, that the DNA evidence in Tyler's confession represented new developments rather than proof of original prosecutorial error, but public pressure was enormous. Tyler Blackwood had died in March, 3 weeks after my release, taking his guilt to the grave but leaving behind his recorded confession as a final act of conscience. His death had generated another wave of media coverage about my case, keeping public attention focused on the injustices I'd suffered. The final settlement was $35 million, paid over 10 years with an immediate lump sum of $10 million. It was more money than I could have imagined during my years of poverty, but no amount could truly compensate for 20 lost years. The money isn't about making you whole, Sarah explained during the settlement signing. Nothing can give you back your 20s and 30s or the time you lost with Sophie. This is about accountability, about forcing the system to pay a price for its failures. I used part of the settlement to establish the Lucas Bennett Foundation, dedicated to supporting wrongful conviction cases and prison education programs. The foundation would fund investigations for indigent prisoners claiming innocence, provide educational resources for incarcerated people, and advocate for criminal justice reforms. Sophie joined the foundation as its first staff attorney, fresh out of law school and passionate about continuing the fight we'd started together. Working with my daughter to help other families affected by wrongful conviction felt like the perfect way to transform our trauma into something positive. The job training program that had helped me transition back to society became a model for other cities. I spoke at conferences about reintegration challenges, testified before legislative committees about the need for support services, and shared my story with anyone who would listen. My first year of freedom was a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media interviews, public speaking, and personal adjustment. But gradually I began to feel human again, to remember who I'd been before prison and to discover who I might become in this new chapter of my life. The speaking engagement contract that arrived 18 months after my release came from Harvard Law School, inviting me to deliver the keynote address at their annual Criminal Justice Reform Symposium. Standing at that podium, addressing future lawyers and judges, I reflected on the journey from wrongfully convicted prisoner to criminal justice advocate. The foundation Sophie and I had established was thriving. In its first year, we'd helped secure 3 exonerations, funded college courses for over 200 incarcerated people, and advocated for legislative reforms. Sophie had become a formidable wrongful conviction attorney, arguing cases with the skill and passion I'd never received during my own trial. My relationship with Dr. Patricia Williams from Second Chances had evolved from professional to personal. She brought stability and joy to my newly reconstructed life. Understanding my past without being intimidated by it. Tyler Blackwood's death had been difficult to process. I felt no satisfaction in his suffering, only gratitude for his final act of courage in confessing the truth. Tyler wasn't evil, I told reporters. He was a broken person who made a terrible choice. His confession took courage and gave me back my freedom. The speaking engagements had become crucial to my new identity. I addressed police academies, prosecutor training programs, and shared my story with anyone who would listen. The most meaningful was returning to Millbrook Correctional Facility to speak to current inmates about education, hope, and redemption. I spent 20 years in this place for a crime I didn't commit, I told them, but I didn't waste those years. Your circumstances don't define your potential. Use your time here to become someone better. 2 years after my release, I stood in my apartment looking at a wall covered with photos from my new life mixed with treasured items from prison letters from Sophie, my GED certificate, photos of men I'd mentored. The wall represented both loss and redemption, trauma and triumph. My story wasn't just about wrongful conviction anymore. It was about resilience, redemption, and the power of truth to eventually overcome lies. It was about a father and daughter who'd maintained their bond despite impossible circumstances, about a system that could be reformed by people who refused to accept injustice. Standing in my apartment that evening, I realized that Tyler's conscience breaking hadn't just freed my body from prison, it had freed both of us from the lie that had poisoned 2 decades. His deathbed confession had been an act of redemption that gave meaning to his suffering and purpose to mine. I thought about the 3-year-old girl who'd reached for her daddy across a courtroom railing 23 years earlier, and the accomplished attorney she'd become despite growing up in the shadow of wrongful conviction. Sophie's strength and success weren't just personal victories, they were proof that love and truth could survive even the most devastating injustices. The price of silence, as I'd learned, was measured not just in lost years or broken families, but in the corruption of truth itself. But a guilty conscience, no matter how long buried, has the power to resurrect justice when someone finally finds the courage to speak. My freedom came with responsibility to the men still fighting wrongful convictions, to the families destroyed by systemic failures, to the memory of Harold Winters, and to the belief that justice, however delayed, is always worth pursuing. That responsibility had become my purpose, and that purpose had made me whole again. 20 years behind bars for a crime I didn't commit had taught me that innocence alone isn't enough. You need people willing to fight for truth, systems willing to admit mistakes, and the unwavering belief that justice will eventually prevail. Sometimes it takes 2 decades for a guilty conscience to crack, but when it finally does, the truth has the power to set everyone free.